Hi, my name is Don Daglow, and this is Next Gen Lessons, Learning from Past Console Wars. And I think that very quickly here you're going to understand why I'm the one who's asked to talk about past console wars, because I've been through a few of these. I started my career in games in 1971, almost 50 years ago, as a university student doing games on mainframes. In the 1980s, when the industry started, I became one of the original 5 game programmers for Mattel's Intellivision game console. From there, I was recruited into a little startup called Electronic Arts, which worked out pretty well. And I also ran Broderbund's Entertainment and Education division. Then for 20 years, I led Stormfront Studios, which was a AAA console game development studio that I started. And for about the last 10 years, I've been working as an advisor on a variety of projects, seeing a lot of different issues, working on everything from mobile games to online games to traditional AAA. So I've had the chance to work in every generation of video game console in the history of the industry. And what I'm going to do is share stories with you from each of those generations and give you an idea of some patterns, and then you can decide for yourself whether you think those patterns apply to the future and in what ways they might apply and how we can react as modern game developers to those opportunities. So I'm going to start with the patterns of game history, those are the stories, and then we'll go to how we apply those lessons to the future. Now, there's a temptation always to think of video game history as being a series of kings or queens coming to take over the throne. And very often the story is told that way. Well, here's first generation, second generation, third generation. And it's presented as if it's very nice and neat. Well, this kind of a nice, neat array of kings and queens is not what we have in the industry. We have something more like this. This is what it was like after the reign of Charlemagne. And as you can see, his successors to the throne were not exactly, it wasn't a simple story to tell. What we have to say about video games is going to be much more like Charlemagne's story than it will be a nice, neat first generation, second generation, third generation sort of tale. So if we start back at the beginning of systems that have cartridges and interchangeable games, so we're skipping past Pong. The 2 first very successful consoles were the Atari VCS and the Intellivision. And of course I want to mention the Intellivision because I ended up being director of game design for Intellivision. And this means I need to remind you that, as was said in all the TV and magazine commercials back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Intellivision was clearly superior. And we had TV ads and magazine ads showing this. Here you can see the American baseball game comparison between Atari and Intellivision. And of course, what was never mentioned was the Intellivision started about 2 years later, and so it had a more modern chip. It was almost like a next gen compared to the Atari. And so we always had that hardware advantage. So for a period of time, this was a very active console war. Now you'll see the term console war is not used in these newspaper stories because that term didn't come till much, much later. But for example, Atari video games, a rocket ship to riches, and Christmas is a video game. So that was the year 1981 when every kid wanted an Atari or an Intellivision for Christmas. But then a surprise happened. We get to 1983. This has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And at the end of 1983, the beginning of 1984, what happens? Well, the games industry loses its sparkle. And now we have articles in the same New York Times that 2 years before was saying, everybody wants video games. Now they're saying, well, if you look at the end of this article, kids now have switched to home computers, or they've returned to traditional non-electronic fun. At that point, as this article shows, people thought video games were over. Okay, that was a fad. Now it's past, it's done. Of course, sitting here in 2020, where we're looking at it from 37 years later, we can say that's nuts. But at the time, a lot of people thought video games were done, were over, were just another old toy. And that's why the industry cratered. We went from having thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in business to across the entire industry having only a few hundred video game and computer game jobs and having well under $1 billion in revenue. In fact, in 1984, I'm not sure what the number is. I've seen different rival suggestions, but it was barely in the hundreds of millions. The industry collapsed. One of the reasons it collapsed was that the next master, you saw that article and it talked about kids are either they've stopped playing anything electronic at all, or now they've gone to home computers. Well, the home computer that became the dominant home computer of this time and helped end that first video game era was the Commodore 64. And they had television ads where there were varieties of them, but the message was always, if your child can be playing a video game, or they can be learning on a computer, which one would you rather do? And of course, all around the world, parents are saying, well, I wouldn't want my kids playing video games when they could be learning on a computer. I need to get a home computer. And Commodore's sales exploded. And Commodore became the dominant game machine. Now you can say, wait a second. The commercials said, don't have your kids play video games. They're bad. Home computers are good because they're educational. But now you're saying the biggest video game machine during this period in the mid-'80s was the Commodore 64? That's right, the Commodore that was sold for being an educational and useful home computer. Most of all was used for games because, of course, video games weren't dead. We were merely migrating into different hardware. Other things happened in this interesting period of the mid-'80s. One of them is that Electronic Arts was founded, and I had the opportunity and the privilege to be an early employee there. And EA had a very different idea. And one of those different ideas, you can't quite see it all here, but this is an old magazine ad that asked the question, can a computer make you cry? And it had this photograph of some of the original developers of EA's games. The people here were not the president and the senior vice president and the Grand Duke of Electronic Arts. They were not company executives. In fact, only one of the people in this picture actually worked for EA. But these were the game developers themselves. Today, you might not find that to be interesting or different. But you'll notice here on the right-hand side, I've got a picture of the cover of an old TV guide. Well, in 1982, when Atari and Intellivision were having their great rivalry, TV Guide was the largest, most popular magazine in the United States, and it had all the television listings. And they wanted to do an interview with the Intellivision game designers. And Mattel toy companies said, okay, sure, that's great. We love the publicity, but their names are secret. So you'll have to change all their names. So this article comes out with an interview with us when the reporter came and met with us. But except for a couple of people, you can't tell who's who because all of our names have been changed. And that's because Atari was hiring programmers from Mattel. Mattel was hiring programmers from Atari. Then Coleco came in and was hiring programmers from everybody. And Activision was trying to take people. So this was a new idea. And only Activision and Electronic Arts were doing this back at this time and promoting the actual creators of the games. So that was an innovation that came during this dark period after the crash of games. So during this time in the mid-'80s, the producers and some of the other people at Electronic Arts who were working on products, we would go out to lunch, and we were in an office that was on a hill in San Mateo, California. There weren't a lot of restaurants nearby. And so we would walk down to this Denny's restaurant. And if you're not familiar with Denny's, this is like a diner, and they would have pancakes all day and hamburgers and salads and so on. And we would go here all the time. And while we were sitting around over lunch, one of the things that we talked about a lot was what would happen when computer games and video games became broadcast quality. So we had the same resolution, the same number of colors as a regular television show that people watched on TV, because you watched video games on TV. You watched computer games on monitors that were a lot like TVs. So we thought, once a game looks just like everything else you watch on your TV, then it's going to become clear that this is a new artistic medium. It's an art form. It's important, and then games can draw a bigger audience and be more recognized. Now, it's important to remember, this is a game called, a screenshot from a game called Adventure Construction Set that I was working on with Stuart Smith in 1984. And this was state-of-the-art for game graphics on many of these systems in 1984. So when we started talking about, well, you know, when we have broadcast quality graphics, that's going to be exciting, we had a little ways to go when we said that. Nevertheless, I wanted to share this thought because we're going to come back to it later, and it's an important idea that turns out to play a very important role later on in game history. So I mentioned how the Commodore 64 had been so successful it became the dominant machine. And they were so successful, they said, well, you know, maybe some people want, you know, a cheaper machine or a more powerful machine. And we want to please anybody. We want to squeeze everybody else out of the home computer market. And the Commodore 64 had 64K of RAM. That's where its name came from. Now, if you started trying to program in it, there was only 32K left of that RAM when you actually started to write your program. The rest was taken by the system. But never mind, it was the Commodore 64. So they introduced an inexpensive Commodore 16, and for more power-focused users, they introduced the Commodore 128. And the 16 had 16K of RAM, and the 128 had 128K of RAM. This is a pattern we see over and over again in games history. A manufacturer becomes very powerful, then they start making all these different devices and creating confusion in the marketplace about what one system somebody should buy. And of course, surprise, things change again, unexpectedly. Commodore is just like Atari. Commodore was dominant. Atari is dominant, Commodore is dominant, but then along comes the original Nintendo NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. And getting video games back into the stores was almost impossible. Nintendo's sales leaders would go into stores and say, we have this great new video game, it's already a success in Japan. And the store owners would say, no, 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 get away. Video games are gone, they died, we lost a lot of money at the end. No, we don't want video games anymore. Home computers are it, video games are over. And Nintendo's leaders had to go through all these different hoops and special offers just to get stores to try carrying the Nintendo Entertainment System. And of course, finally, as we know now, once it was in stores, it started to sell. And then it sold more and more, and suddenly it became a huge hit. And now suddenly, video games that were dead and replaced with home computers are now alive again. So here we've got a report from the Los Angeles Times in 1988, after the Nintendo Entertainment System had really gotten settled in as a dominant system. Suddenly, no video games. Here we've got the headline, new technology, better marketing gives video games a second life. I will tell you, most of the people marketing games in 1988 had experience marketing games in 1983, but never mind. But here was this image of now video games are back, and Nintendo are the ones who brought us back. If you ever talk to executives from Nintendo, be sure to thank them, because we were gone as video game consoles until they brought us back. You'll also notice the word console is nowhere here. That word comes along much later into our vocabulary. But of course, you probably are starting to expect this. Now we have a surprise. Yes, something else happened because along comes the Sega Mega Drive. In the United States, it was called the Sega Genesis. And because Nintendo had waited a while to update their system, now they had a rival, and Sega did very well. And they faced off against the Super Nintendo system. And so we had that console war. And as it turned out, in North America, the Sega Genesis sold the most. For the world overall, Super Nintendo sold the most. So now we had a holiday war. We had a Christmas sales war once again. And now we're up to being a $3 billion a year industry in 1991. So we've come back, not all the way back to the $5 billion we were in the original cycle of consoles, but we're getting there now, back at $3 billion. And so this war goes on, but Sega starting to pull out into the lead, especially in North America. Then they say, well, let's have some more varieties of hardware. So then we see the Sega 32X, which was a unit that added computing power and graphics power to the Sega Genesis and the Sega Mega Drive, and you would just drop it into the cartridge slot. And there was the Sega CD, which was an innovative new peripheral. It brought CDs to games, which is a very, very important moment. But it was adding a CD drive to a cartridge-based system instead of having a CD-based game player. And now, once again, we've got all these pieces of hardware coming up, and which can create confusion. But it really looked like Sega and Nintendo, that's the console war. Those two are facing off. It's just going to be Sega and Nintendo. Sega versus Nintendo. That's what we're going to see. But then, of course, we have another surprise. Because what happens? Along comes the PS1, the PlayStation. And the Sony PlayStation now does extremely well, and it is the first native CD big successful system. And of course, it has Sony, a big, powerful corporation behind it. So now our console war gets more complicated because Sony passes Sega. Suddenly Sega, now here we are, we're in 1996. Now Sega is cutting prices, trying to come back and somehow get back at Sony because they've been passed. But then we move on. By 1997, now it's the Nintendo 64 that's the rival to Sony PlayStation. So now Nintendo is trying to strike back. So we continue to have different competitors each time. Then we get to 2000 and Microsoft unveils the Xbox. So now we're getting where every few years we have these new platforms coming along. And with it, more powerful systems and more sales. So Xbox, of course, as we know now, turns out to be a major new platform that takes the number 2 position in the marketplace. The PS2 comes along and follows the PlayStation 1, the original PlayStation. And so we now have a console war of Xbox versus PlayStation 2. And now this war has replaced the Nintendo versus Sega competition. And then, of course, well, it's kind of a surprise. Because the surprise is the market leader held serve. The market leader from one generation was the same market leader the next generation. So if you look at this sales curve running from 2003 to 2006, instead of falling off like everybody always has, they managed to continue to grow their sales. And then we see Xbox come up behind them. So if we look at the way, we talked at the beginning about how the different kings and queens succeed each other. Well, we hadn't had much of a succession to this point because Atari failed to carry on. Commodore took away the crown. Nintendo took the crown from Commodore. Sega took the crown from Nintendo. Sony took the crown from Sega. But then Sony kept the crown for another generation, competing with Xbox. And this brings in kind of a new era. And we talk about in history the Pax Romano, which goes for 207 years until the year 180. Sometimes this is also named after Augustus Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome, who began this era. And I refer to this era that we're entering here in this period as the Pax Soniana, the 12 years from 1994 to 2006. Because from the time that the first PlayStation was introduced until 2006, when the PS2 and the original Xbox have had their own console war and come in number 1 and number 2, those two systems, Xbox and Sony, have in fact been the dominant ones towards the later part of that period, but Sony has always been number 1. Sony spent 12 years as the number 1 system, and primarily in North America, or especially in North America, but really now it becomes a global industry. And being number 1 means being number 1 all the way around the world. Now, this was very good in certain ways in terms of predictability. It was a very good time in the industry in terms of being able to predict how many units you could sell and how many games you should manufacture and what games would be popular. But there was a downside to this too. So let's look here at this example. Here we've got a sample person, and I have to tell you, I made this person up, who is, here we are in 2006, and this person's headline in LinkedIn is, I have 12 years of game production experience. 12 years of game production experience in 1996 in that young industry, that's a lot of experience. And so, or from 1994 to 2006. And so, you know, we see they started in 1994. They're an AP on a PSX title. PSX, by the way, is the original code name for the PS1. So I find myself falling into that. Then they go on, and they're a senior producer for Xbox and PS2, and we have cross-platform titles on both systems. And then they are promoted to exec producer. They're a very good producer. They go up to for PS3 and Xbox 360. They now are an executive producer. So very experienced, very senior leader in the industry. And there were quite a few people who fit a mold like this, where they had 10 to 15 years of experience. But most of their experience as leaders came during the Pax Soniana, the 12 years when Sony really dominated. And normally this might not have been a problem, but of course, the vision we had of just Sony and PlayStation marching on by themselves didn't come true, and we had another surprise. And so the first surprise, you could say, is the Wii. Now, Nintendo, you saw their logo disappear from this litany, this list of console wars. They went back and they said, well, if we try and do what Microsoft and Sony are doing, you know, that's going to be hard. That's a crowded market. Let's give the world a completely different kind of game. And so they gave us the Wii, which was much less graphical power and much less complex. It was a game, a system with simple games aimed at families, and with a controller where you used hand gestures to control the game instead of a traditional controller. So instead of sitting on your couch or your chair and playing your game, you were standing up and acting things out. And a lot of people in the industry said, oh, underpowered, that's the Wii, good name. That system is going to die out. That's going to be a total failure. And instead, it turns out the Wii was the best-selling platform for the first 2 to 3 years of that hardware generation. So here we have headlines. PlayStation 3 beats Xbox 360, but the Wii outsells them both. This created tremendous problems for companies in the industry because Every company, every publisher, every hardware company had thought, all right, Sony, Microsoft dominate. We can plan. We know what's going to happen. We can build up our staffs. We can spend our money. We can do our marketing. We can develop our games. And then what happens? The Wii comes along and takes the #1 spot. So Sony and Microsoft are selling fewer games than planned. Because their price is higher, the Wii is lower. They had supply problems. The Wii did not have supply problems. And because the Wii had all the press and all the word of mouth as this is the great new video game, then you start to see TV and magazine and newspaper and online stories about the Wii is the winner of the new console war. The Wii is the new big hit. And owners of Sony and Microsoft games are looking saying, but no, that's not like our games. That's not even a real game. What are you doing? You're confusing everything. They're not the best sellers. They sell more. Oh, and it's all so confused. Well, confusion is not good for sales, and it was a bad time for a while there. After 3 or 4 years, Sony and Microsoft caught and passed the Wii, and the Wii faded. But that was the first surprise. Oh, but wait. Oh, yeah, that's right. There was another surprise. This guy. Steve Jobs comes along with the iPhone. And it turns out once the App Store gets selling, what is by far the best-selling category of app in the App Store? It's games. Now we have a whole new category of a game and a whole new platform that isn't Sony or Nintendo. It isn't Microsoft. It isn't even played on a screen. And it's taking $3 billion of consumers' money out of the pool that might otherwise have gone to the console makers. Now, what a lot of people would argue is, no, it didn't take anything away from the console makers because these are new players. Many of these players are people who never played electronic games before. But now, with the iPhone, with the touch screen, with a completely different system, completely different assumptions, completely different interface, and by the way, you already have it in your pocket. With all of that, the iPhone becomes this major new platform. So now we have these surprises because we have the platform surprise from the Wii, we have the surprise from the iPhone, we have all these new different kinds of games, the internet is growing, browser, all these different things are happening. Yeah, there's another surprise. Yeah, this was a period of a lot of surprises. And you remember I mentioned back how in the mid-1980s we were saying when games get to be broadcast quality, then we will get the recognition, then we'll become more of a mass market medium. We'll start to be big like television, like film, and so on. Well, we hit that point in about 2006. I use this as one example of it. This is actually a 2010 story, but it's about Gran Turismo 5 coming out on the PS3. And PS3, of course, comes out in 2006. And here you can see, I highlighted it, they're saying all broadcast quality because now you can download video that's broadcast quality from the net onto your video game console. That is the definition of being broadcast quality. You can watch broadcasts on it instead of watching via your television. So this is a big moment because this is the moment when we go from being inferior toys compared to television and other media to being parallel equals with other media. Now that's a very good thing in many ways, but it also presents problems. For all of games history, from Atari versus Intellivision up to the wars between Microsoft and Sony, until this point, we'd always be able to show this screen. Here's our new hardware. Here's the old screen. Here's the new. See how much better it is? But now, when we're talking about broadcast quality, now suddenly the difference between the graphics on one generation of hardware and the difference in the next is not so obvious. Those of us who are game fans, all the lighting effects, look at this. No, there's all these differences. but we're game aficionados. For the public at large, it begins to get blurry what game is better than another, what's obvious about being better. And here, for this example, I found one website, nintendoeverything.com. They did a side-by-side comparison for the PS3, the PS4, and the Switch, and said, okay, here's how the same shot looks in all three systems. And there are a lot of qualifiers. You could say, well, yeah, but it was ported from here to there, and it's from this era. But the fact is, consumers at large don't care about all those issues. To them, systems now look more and more the same. It's only the game aficionados who are going to follow that difference. And so now, when we go from hardware generation to hardware generation, it's a much less obvious case for many people why they should buy a new system. But of course, they aren't just looking at Sony and Xbox, because in terms of being the leading consoles during this time, we could say, well, you know, the Switch, the Wii, those are different sorts of platforms. They're kind of competing in a different way. It's still really Sony versus Microsoft. But no, it isn't really. What it really is, and that's why I say this is no longer a surprise because we all know it, is it isn't just a two-horse race or a three-horse race anymore. Yes, we have Sony, we have Microsoft, we have Nintendo, but we have iOS and Android. We have Epic going from being a developer to being a publisher to now being a store and integrating everything. We have the browsers facing off. We have Facebook games. We have Steam revitalizing PC. So it is no longer just a console war, a two-horse race. That's the only thing that's going on. Everything else doesn't matter, which we had for a good part of game history. But now we have a real worldwide market with many kinds of games for many kinds of different audiences, because we passed that broadcast standard. And now games are everywhere. Now we are as big or bigger than television or film or other media. We did all those things we talked about in the 1980s, but it comes with complications, because now it isn't as simple as 2 or 3 machines competing. Now we're competing for audience time with everything and everybody, because now games, we have to compete with cable television, we have to compete with other games, we have to compete with smartphones, with tablets, with browsers, with the internet, with everything. All this has become one market, and we're all after people's attention. Attention is what we're after, and the form of attention we want is gameplay. This is a very different world now than the world we were in back then. So those are patterns. I wanted to get to those to talk about what we do next, to think about where are we going with all this. So some thoughts to leave you with, because I think it's your ideas that are going to matter. So if most new generations over this 40-year period that we're talking about, actually over 40 years, if almost every generation has produced these surprises, and if new kinds of game hardware are bringing into games big new audiences, even here, the Commodore 64, being home computers, that brought us a new audience. Even as it was killing off the original consoles, it brought us a new audience. Then how should you plan for the next surprises and the next new audiences? Because instead of assuming that the world is going to go on being defined by Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo, or if you have a different view, by iOS and Android, or if you have a different view by Chrome and Edge, or if you have a different view by Twitch and Facebook, or you get my point. It isn't just one way the world's going to evolve. We are going to be surprised. There will be new developments, new players, new things. How do we change our thinking to adapt to that kind of world and to not repeat the mistakes of one king or queen dominating games and then losing to the next company and losing to the next company, where the winner of each generation turns into a loser on the next? We have to think differently for that not to happen. So that's why I say assume change, not stability. Instead of assuming that the world of 1, 2, 5 years from now will be just like today's world or will be a natural evolution of it, maybe it's crazy and different. If you assumed the world if you're in 2005 and you're thinking about the world in 2010, you thought, well, it's going to evolve logically with Sony and Microsoft. No, 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 that's not how it went. Well, that's going to happen again, only we don't know exactly how it's going to happen because it's the future. But you can have an attitude, an assumption that change is what's coming, change is the next thing, and that is what can drive you. You can try multiple strands of innovation, not just one or two. So we've got all our logos of different things you can do, different kinds of platforms. You can try things instead of just, well, I'll do the one or two most popular things. You can take chances as long as you're careful, as long as you take chances where you can afford to lose. Because in every generation, as we've seen, we have surprise winners and surprise losers. You can brainstorm alternate platforms. What other things might we support? But you want to visit them, but you want to keep your passport because sometimes great new platforms don't work out because not every great new idea turns out to be right. And then finally, I would share, I'm in my 50th year of making games after starting in 1971. Mostly, I've been very lucky, and the reason I'm still making games after 50 years is that I've been lucky. But I will say I've learned how to adapt, to go with the times, and to embrace new technology, new ideas, new audiences, new kinds of games. And so that's what I share as my biggest piece of advice of all, is be ready to adapt, change, and grow. And frankly, it's fun, it's exciting. I love to make games as much now as I did 50 years ago. I still get as excited working on a project, getting up in the morning to work on a game. I still have that same joy now I had then. And being open to change enables that. So my big question is, what kind of game will you be working on 5 years from now? And what kind of changes do you think might happen that you could start exploring now so that when 5 years from now comes, you are ready to make that game? Thank you so much for tuning in and coming to see this presentation. I really appreciate your time. This is my contact information, my book, Indie Games from Dream to Delivery, and I look forward to having chances to talk with you, answer questions both online and in the months and the years that follow. Thank you very, very much.